together for our next time.
Hello,
Okay.
hello. Welcome, friends. Welcome. We are here. We are here. Welcome to this Reclaiming Soul Work podcast, where we are reclaiming the sacred in soul work for healers, counselors, practitioners, social workers, and anyone who's really, sort of loving and doing this work of spiritual based healing, who really, who want the space for us. We're doing this one episode at a time. I am one half of your host, one half of your co-host, Biani. And we have my lovely friend, who's probably this way, my lovely friend, Sequoia. I was like, which side are we on? And y'all, we're so happy to have you here today. This is episode 4 of our podcast. And honestly, before I continue, I want to just give ourselves props that we made it to episode 4. Sequoia and I have been working on this podcast for a really long time, and making it to episode 4 feels huge to me. So I just want to give us so much props right now. We're still here. Did you want to say anything about that, Sequoia, before we continue?
Yeah, I mean, it takes a lot of time and energy just to show up, in a lot of spaces. I think we made space for that, during episode 3 at the beginning, you know. Right now we are recording this, during Pride Month, Juneteenth. Folks are celebrating Juneteenth yesterday. So we had the combo of Pride Teens going on, and there have been just a lot of things happening, politically, socially, emotionally, not only from like the global level, but then also nationally, locally, and within our communities. And so, Biani and I wear a lot of different hats. And so we are just really it takes what I'm trying to say is it takes a lot, and we are really committed to not only just the other hats that we wear, but then also to this. I enjoy talking about these, topics. And so, yeah, woot woot to us. Woot woot.
Yes, serious. Pride Teenth. I love that. Pride Teenth. Yeah, like we're really grateful, and we're celebrating these wins. Like, we made it to episode 4, and we hope you'll be back next week next time, because we have 2 more episodes that we're cooking up before we take a break. But we are so glad for y'all to be here, and we're celebrating this win that we're here. So today's episode is titled "Everything That You Know About Spiritual Social Work is Wrong." And, we're here to really bust some myths, so to like kind of expose assumptions and stereotypes about spiritual social work, spiritual counselors, spiritual practitioners, like anybody who's sort of doing this work. We really wanted to make space to really kind of air out all the kind of stereotypes that have really impacted the way we work. Honestly, I would argue that it does have an impact on how we work. So we're really glad that y'all can be here. And the truth of it is that everything we know about spiritual social work or spiritual counseling is wrong. And we are here to like name those things and then make space for what we do really know and what's real and what's true about spiritual social work and spiritual counseling and spiritual practitioners. So we love to hear from y'all. Like, if you have questions or comments about, if you have your own like kind of stereotypes that you've heard of, like, please share it with us. We are in community with you, so we'd love to hear it. Because the truth of it is, like, a lot of these stereotypes, we have assumed them to be true. And we're here to talk about how wrong they are and untrue they are. So, yeah.
Cool. Thank you so much for that, Biani. And I just want to say welcome everyone again. Reclaiming Soul Work is a heart-centered podcast by 2 queer Black femme healers and spiritual social workers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, identity, and ancestral connections through the lens of tarot, divination, mysticism, mental health, and everything in between. As Biani mentioned, my name is Sequoia. I use she and her pronouns. I as I mentioned, wear a lot of different hats, but here in this capacity, as a therapist, a spiritual social worker, I am currently in Anchorage, Alaska, on Dena'ina land where I live and work, and spread across a few other places, but mostly, occupy this space. Let's see, what else do I want to say? I'm an aunt, I'm a caregiver, a business owner, someone who, practices different types of grounding to, connect to my ancestors as well as to keep myself, here grounded. And yeah, what else? I am an Aquarius sun. Um, right now, I am loving seafood. I have
Mm.
been on a wellness journey, related to my eating habits. And so incorporating more like fish and things into my regimen. I feel like I'm really not sure why I shared that, but I feel like maybe that'll resonate for somebody or, just like support someone else in their eating habits right now.
Yeah,
And so, yeah, Bianna, you want to introduce yourself?
I love that. I love that. Um, it made me think of like water too. Like, I wonder if there's a connection to like your work with water right now too. That just came to me. I don't know what that means,
Mm-hmm.
but um, hey everybody, Biani, she they pronouns. I live and I live on unceded Lenape territory, also known as Philadelphia. Um, I'm a proud Bronxite. I was born and raised in the Bronx, and I love Philly. Like, Philly's home. I've been in Philly longer than I have been in New York. Like, just as an adult. So I have to acknowledge that Philly's home. I'm saying that to all my Philly peeps who are like, come on, you're from Philly now. Um, so yeah, and it's interesting, like thinking about identity right now and like where I'm feeling like the spaces that I'm occupying in the moment. I am a parent. I have 3 little kids, so that really keeps me busy. I'm also a business owner, um, a therapist, a coach, and a consultant, and feeling like I'm at a crossroads around like my future and my career. So like that feels important as we enter like Cancer season. Um, my rising sign is in Cancer, and I really identify with Cancer season. So there's something about this energy that's really drawing me in to kind of lean in. And I think what else? Oh yeah, I'm a writer. I'm a total tarot nerd. I love tarot. Love talking about it. I love talking about the art. I love talking about sort of different approaches to tarot readings and offering support to folks. Um, and yeah, I think that's it. I don't know if there's anything else, but yeah, that's me.
That sounds great. Thank you so much, Biani, for that. The only other thing that I wanted to say before we transition into what's up next is, if you are with us watching, while we're live, please let us know in the comments, like what city and or state that you're tuning in from, or if you want to, you can definitely let us know like what time zone you're in. And if you're watching this on the playback, like please include that information in the comments as well. We love to know like where folks are, watching us from. And again, if you're watching us, if you have any questions, if you want to chat with us, if anything that comes up resonates for you, please definitely add it in the comments. We'll read it out loud. We love to chat with you.
Oh, thank you for that. And here's your friendly reminder. If this is your first time watching us, welcome, 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 welcome. And if you haven't done so already, subscribe to our channel because we'll have more amazing content like this for you. So just subscribe to Reclaiming Soul Work podcast. We are on YouTube and we are also on Spotify for our audio babes. So yeah, let's get started. So, as we always say, we're really excited about this topic, and it's true. Sequoia and I, we put a lot of heart and soul into this work, like to just sort of bring this education to our community. And every topic we bring to y'all, we are excited about, like real talk, like we are hype about it. And this one was something that we've been kind of thinking about for a while. So like, yeah, everything that that we know about spiritual social work is wrong. And we're here to expose those myths and stereotypes of what makes a spiritual social worker and counselor. Because the truth is that some of these stereotypes are making it hard, y'all. They're making it hard for us to practice and support folks who may be interested in a perspective that centers spiritual and holistic wellness. And I think I've said it on Instagram. I might have posted about it, but it does get under my skin, a lot of these stereotypes personally, because I think that they're intentionally designed to make folks really like take the sacred and the spiritual out of healing work. And there are a lot of reasons that happens, right? Like, we think about academia, like this profession, like our training. We talked about it in previous episodes, how our training really takes the spiritual and the soul work out of it, because sometimes we're so focused on what evidence-based research does this support? Like, that, is this effective? Like that kind of framing is helpful. Sure. I mean, yes, I think research is important. Definitely important to kind of make sure that we know what works and what might not work for some folks. But also this work is not just a science, but an art form. And we think a lot of these stereotypes really make it hard for people to really bring their full selves to this healing work sometimes. So that's like my rant a little bit. I mean, we'll talk about it more, but do you have anything else you want to share before I introduce the topics we're going to cover? Because I did go a
No,
little bit.
uh-huh. No. I
Okay,
was
cool.
just gonna say, no, that rant was great. I'm
Okay,
here for it. I'm here for the
cool,
rant.
cool. So good. I'm glad. So y'all, we can do like 3 episodes on this topic. We acknowledge that. Okay. We also want to say that there's going to be some topics we won't cover. But just know that, if you subscribe to our newsletter, you'll get first dibs on like some of
Mhm.
like, behind the scenes content that we might have not covered. Or we might go into depth on our blog. We do have a blog, so y'all need to check us out on our website. So like if you sign up for our newsletter, you will get first dibs on this type of information. You'll be the first to know. So just know that we're not going to cover everything. Right now, what we're going to focus on, we're going to talk a little bit about what folks say when they mean they're spiritual. We're also going to talk a little bit about questions that spiritual practitioners can ask or address to really invite the sacred, the spiritual in the work. And then we're going to talk a little bit about the difference between faith-based counseling and spiritual counseling. And at the end, we're going to sort of close out talking a little bit about tarot. Sequoia and I are both tarot practitioners, tarot readers, and we love tarot and we love the usefulness of tarot in therapy. It's an amazing therapeutic tool. But we're going to talk a little bit about some of the ways that it could be hard to use tarot, like the kind of struggles that some practitioners might have bringing in tarot into their work. Did I cover everything, friend?
I think you did. I think
Okay.
that's an amazing overview. Yeah, yeah.
Yay.
So how you ready to jump right in?
Yeah, let's talk about what folks say when they mean they're spiritual. Why don't you take it
Okay.
away?
Okay. Yeah, that I definitely can. So
Yeah.
one of the things that I wanted to share is that, I back in April, I attended this amazing webinar hosted by the Institute of Chicanic Psychology. And the title of this webinar was The Importance of Psychospirituality and Trauma Healing. And the facilitator gave an amazing definition of spirituality. So her definition of spirituality was the quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material physical things, like a shift in your priorities. And then she also gave a definition of what is psychospirituality. And she defined that as a wide range of therapeutic systems which embrace a spiritual dimension. And so when I think about, like what is spiritual social work? What does that mean in the context of, emotional support, wellness, right? I think about that from a few different avenues. So, meaning that I'm talking about ancestral connections, right? I'm talking about divination practices potentially, and not just necessarily tarot, right? But other ways or other tools that folks bring to sessions or, have had some experience related to divination. I'm talking about, indigenous healing practices. So, nature, right? Talking about music, the incorporation of music, even, the healing properties of that. So, for me, that's kind of how I approach it, and those were just a few ways. What you think, Biani?
I love it. And I actually want to ask you if you can read the definition of spirituality again.
Oh yeah, it will be my
Yeah.
pleasure.
I know that people can rewind it, but I think there's something for me that I just want to really let that settle. So if you can read the
Sure.
definitions again.
Oh, yeah, definitely. So, the definition of spirituality, and again, this is from that webinar, the
Mhm.
quality of being concerned with the human spirit or soul as opposed to material, physical things. So, a shift in priorities. And then she defined what is psychospirituality as a wide range of therapeutic systems which embrace a spiritual dimension.
Mm. I really love those definitions, and I love how you really
Mhm.
centered us into thinking about, like, this is what we mean when we say spiritual, right? And I love the idea of the quality of being concerned with the human spirit. I mean, I think that's a great way to kind of like center us today. Like, it's the concern, right? Like, it's we
Mhm.
are sitting with spirits too, right? Like, we're not just sitting with quote unquote physical bodies, but like everybody has a soul, everybody has a
Mhm.
spirit. And I love that kind of invitation for us to like really ground in that as spiritual social workers and practitioners. Um, and it made me think of sort of the the ways that I think about energy and how, like, actually, I'll say this. I feel like a lot of social work is psycho spiritual. We just don't call it that. And one of the things that just came to me was around when we talk about inner child work, or we talk about IFS, internal family systems, or we talk about meditation and mindfulness. That's all psycho spiritual, right? That's all an
Definitely.
embracing of a spiritual dimension. This idea that there are younger parts that we embody from time to time is spiritual. It's deeply spiritual. And I for us, what we're inviting here, y'all, as you like watch us, is like that the concern of the human spirit has always been there. We just haven't really been like real about it. We haven't really been honest about it. We haven't really been like centering in that truth. Um, that we do the work is spiritual, that we're doing it. And I think sometimes our focus on other aspects of quote unquote the work takes us away from the spiritual. Um, so this is what we mean when we say spiritual. And some of the realities too is that when folks say that they're spiritual, it doesn't always mean that they're intersectional. And that's really important. Um, and some of the things that Sequoia mentioned, I really love, because this idea of connection to ancestral connections, indigenous healing practices, music, nature, connecting with somebody's inner divinity, like to me, that is spiritual. And it's also like intersectional because it's honoring the person's like practices, like their own practices too, like bringing it into the work. And yeah, I'm realizing I'm stumping a little bit, but I think sometimes spiritual, what we mean by spiritual isn't always intersectional. We want folks to pay attention to that.
Hmm.
Do you want to add
Yeah.
anything?
Yeah, I want to ask something and then I got a question. So, that piece about the concern for the human spirit, right? So on my Instagram, I posted, I took like a day trip to one of the smaller kind of on the coast cities here in Alaska. And as I was kind of just hanging out by the water, and this kind of goes to maybe your point, Biani, about me talking about seafood, salmon, and you making that connection to water earlier. Um, I was sitting out there, and one of the things that came to me was, you know, um, about capitalism and the disconnection between um, our spirit and our ability to really advocate for ourselves, and how capitalism takes us away from that because we have all these different responsibilities and roles that we have to show up in, and a lot of times there is a misalignment in our values based on those roles and responsibilities from capitalism. And so when you mention that areas of social work are tied into spirituality and that human concern for the spirit. Like I think a lot about like the words like anti-oppressive practices and techniques, anti-racist, practices and techniques and things like that. And being anti-capitalist, right? Like while a lot of that is focused on systems, at the root of that, at the foundation of that work is a concern for the human spirit, our values, and the misalignment in that. So yeah, that's like the other thing that I wanted to add.
That's
Um
powerful. That is no, because it's true. I think one of the ways that this is the example of an intersectional approach to spiritual work, right? Like
Mhm,
you just
mhm,
gave us an example, and I think that's powerful because some of the stereotypes that come up around spiritual social work or spiritual work is that the spiritualist isn't really connecting the other forms of, like they're not connecting the other forms of the other dimensions of healing or the ways that
mhm,
these systems might impact our spiritual wellness. And you just
mhm,
like gave us a really powerful example of how what we mean by spiritual social work is that it is inherently intersectional and political,
mhm.
and that you can't that we can't like meditate away oppression. Like I think sometimes there's a way that people
Yes,
use
yes.
spiritual work to try to like bypass, and not even
Bypass.
just
That's
bypass.
right. That's
They
right.
it is but they don't have an analysis. Like they don't realize
Mhm,
that we have to acknowledge that we are in this system too. That this work is
mhm,
important. This healing work is important. It's inherently spiritual, and
mhm.
there's a system, like a bigger system out there too, that we are
That's
in
right.
constant conflict with and tension with, and like being harmed by. So
That's right.
it's like I love that you gave that example because it really does like bring it home, like why what we mean when we say spiritual social work and what people have gotten wrong is that it's not intersectional, and
Yeah.
it is intersectional. Like
Mhm,
some people have gotten that wrong, or people make assumptions about spiritual social workers as like, oh, you're sort of in the clouds, right? Like you're not really
mhm,
grounded in this reality. And for
mhm,
us, no,
mhm,
we are very much attuned to this reality. Like we are
mhm.
constantly aware of it. um so yeah,
Yeah.
I love that. You also
I
were going to say
thank
something
you.
else.
Um, I mean, this is to your point about why this one topic could be like 3 episodes. Like I can go on and on and on. But even to the piece, and we'll probably have time to talk about this a little bit more, or we'll just make space, to bring this topic back up after our break. But even this piece about evidence-based practice, when and again, bringing it back to like this intersectional approach and concern for the human spirit, right? Like when I hear evidence-based practice, I kind of like I hesitate a little bit about that, right? Because we know that a lot of these practices have only been applied and studied in predominantly white communities, and then there's this expectation that you're supposed to use these practices, these interventions that have a very limited range for who it could potentially be successful for. And when we think about like spiritual social work and the spiritual being political, like I'm definitely coming from a decolonized kind of approach. And so I default to indigenous practices, which usually don't fall under evidence-based practices, you know? And so when we then think about like, oh, this gets into so much stuff. When we get into, how trendy it is now to incorporate spiritual social work and how folks are doing that, and how capitalism is kind of incorporated into these approaches now, and we talk about tarot, and folks getting certified in tarot now, and credentialing and gatekeeping, right? Like, again, I could go on and on and on about that. But what we're talking about is this um, return, but then also highlighting, not being, quiet anymore about indigenous practices that really support the clients that we want to work with.
Mm-hmm.
I think about you and your identity, even in this talk about intersectionality, and the intersections of your identity, being Afro-Latina, and so like what does that mean for you? Like, how does that look? Because we've connected around like Black feminism and how we apply those theories and what it looks like in practice and spiritual social work. I don't know if you want to talk about anything like that, but I always
Sure.
am very interested
Well,
about that.
well, I want to also make sure I define what evidence-based practice is so that we're all on the
Mm-hmm.
same kind of page. And really briefly, y'all, something's happened in this field of social work and like helping professions where we went from seeing and embodying this practice as humanities, like really human centered, to looking at like this process of evidence based where there's a lot of like proving that there's scientific like meat behind it, that there's scientific evidence behind it. And there's been this shift in therapy and social work, whatnot, where it's went from really thinking about the humanities, like when we think about talk therapy and not quote unquote, there's been such a shift away from like psychodynamic or talk therapy or practices that honestly were like really indigenous and really at the core indigenous practices, where now there's a focus on like, oh, is this really effective? Is this a science? Like considering it a science when we think about cognitive behavioral therapy, dialectical behavior therapy, which are really important modalities. It's not to say that they're not, and they are quote unquote effective, but at what cost, right? We're talking about evidence-based, and
Mm-hmm.
at what cost? Because it does, we get into this sort of way that we've lost the art form of this work a little bit. Like this
Mm-hmm.
focus so heavily on science takes us away from the art of doing this work, of being with other souls and human spirits, so that's my ramble. But yeah, in terms of intersectionality, I actually lost the question, but I hope I understand. I feel like I felt it a little bit about what you were saying. Like in terms of intersectionality around my identity, it's funny. I always, and I said this a few episodes ago, like what drew me to social work was a piece around holistic, like looking at the whole person. And I remember being in trainings where like it was never a conversation about the whole person. Like it was just like in theory, like, oh, let's think about the whole person, the person in their environment and their community. But then there was never a kind of experience of who is this person? Who are they in the system? How are they impacted by this system? How does it impact their wellness? How does poverty, trauma, oppression impact their ability to stay well and be in community or whatnot. And I think that's something that's always stayed with me. And I think in terms of my identity as an Afro-Latinx person, it's so interesting. Like I really, Sequoia, I don't remember the question fully, but I think like, oh, I'm wondering like, is this okay to say? But I think, I feel like being Latinx is like super like, we're a diaspora of people, like an ethnic group, not a race, an ethnic group. And I find my experience in certain spaces where, because of my Blackness, I wasn't necessarily welcomed in certain spaces, even if they're like Latinx or Latina or, you know, because of anti-Blackness. And it's interesting because thinking about my experience of like even holding my like indigenous practices, like what comes from my elders, it's still kind of like there's this secret, even in Dominican spaces, around how we practice. And I don't know, it's just been really interesting, I have to say. And I'm on this journey, y'all, like the rest of us, like we're all on this journey of becoming, but I still feel like there's like secrets. There's still things that I'm like learning and uncovering, kind of like the way tarot feels to me. Like there's these secrets and these mysteries that I'm unfolding. But I do feel, you know, I'm Black first, you know, and I feel there's certain spaces in Latinx spaces where it doesn't feel like it's for me because of anti-Blackness. I don't know if that even answered your question. I feel like we're going down another, but it's all good. Another rabbit hole. But yeah, like even that feels interesting when we're talking about like spiritual work. And I really love working with clients when I meet clients who know that I'm Black and Latinx, and you know that I'm really honest about being a spiritualist, like a person who practices in that lens. And I say, hey, I do like tarot and astrology and Reiki, but I meet them where they are, right? Like we don't do tarot readings every session. That's not how that works, right? Like it's organic. But one thing I find, like because of who I am, like I have clients who are sort of like, oh, in certain spaces, I don't feel like it's safe for me to talk about my spiritual practices. And some of it is rooted because of anti-Blackness, you know, and especially as Black Latinx, Afro-Latinx folks, like it's true. Even the fact that some of the indigenous practices that we come from are still not really even like acknowledged in a way or talked about. So yeah, even thinking about that, I appreciate you asking that question because it kind of hones in on like what's left out too of the conversation when we're talking about spiritual wellness, spiritual work. Like there is a lot of conversation now, even in social media, around spiritual practices. And also we have to pay attention to what's left out too. Like when we're talking about indigenous practices, there's a huge, I mean, it's huge, it's vast, indigenous healing practices.
Yes.
You know, and we still don't know enough, you know, like even thinking about my ancestors, like a lot of my elders didn't really get to pass it on to me. So I'm learning it in a different way. But yeah, I hope I feel like you have something else you want to say, and I want to look at our topics here. Like, yeah. Okay. Yeah. All right, cool. You mentioned evidence-based, and I wonder if we want to talk about tarot a little more intentionally.
Okay.
Or
we can do that.
All right, cool. So I'm looking at our list. Okay. Wait, before we talk about tarot, y'all, we do want to make a distinction between faith-based counselors and spiritual counselors, because they're not the same. And again, everything we know about spiritual practitioners is wrong, y'all. So we're here about exposing these myths. They're not the same. There are folks who call themselves faith-based counselors, and that doesn't necessarily mean that they're spiritual. And when we're talking about faith, when we're talking about spiritual counselors, it doesn't necessarily mean that people are talking about faith or religion. And I want to give an example. I remember when I was living in Virginia Beach for a year, and there were so many like faith-based counselors who offered counseling through like they would say they offered counseling through like a Christian lens or like using biblical principles. And I appreciate like people are really clear too. It was very clear about what they offer and they don't offer, which I think is really a helpful frame. And you know, I think it's just something to pay attention to. And we've experienced that. Sequoia could speak for herself, but around certain groups where people might say that they're faith-based, but they're not spiritual, right? And there is a distinction to be made around faith. Maybe it's a person who's like representing like a denomination or like a religion, and spiritual counseling or spiritual practitioners, it's more like expansive and it's more, I would say, like inclusive, and it kind of considers the aspects of a person's spiritual wellness and those dimensions, like Sequoia mentioned, around like psychospirituality. Like we're thinking about the spiritual dimension for that person. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are religious or that they focus on a particular faith. So we want to make that distinction. Did you want to add anything to that, friend?
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that was a great great overview and way to kind of frame this. For me, I identify as queer, and when I think about spirituality, the first thing that a lot of times um folks think or kind of pops into their mind is, that when I say spiritual, I might be talking about, religious or a faith-based kind of lens. And if for me, it's not like it's spiritual, and I think about folks that have, religious trauma, in that distinction, and particularly around their identity, maybe their sexual orientation, like being on, the LGBTQIA plus spectrum, or religious trauma, even from a gender perspective, right? Like being a woman, being a person that identifies as a woman, or, someone who identifies as a femme, right? Like there's religious trauma even around that particular identity. And that distinction as well can go into a number of different areas, but I think it's important to be clear with folks, you know the way that you represent yourself, and that if you're talking about spirit, if you're saying that you're a spiritual social worker or a spiritual therapist, that you aren't coming from a denomination based lens, that you are, more leaning towards just the spiritual dimensions. Um, I think I answered that all the way that I want to. Yeah,
that was
I think
pretty.
that's
Yeah, that
okay
was
for
pretty great.
now.
Yeah, yeah. Like just holding that distinction is really, and I love your
Mm-hmm.
example of, like a lot of folks have religious trauma, um, and yeah, and spiritual really is a little bit more broad and inclusive. It's inclusive. I would say it's
Mm-hmm.
inclusive.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So now that we made that distinction, um, one of the things that we've noticed in our work is the sort of anxieties that spiritual, actually, like I would say, like folks who do this work and who might do it private and really want to bring it into their work as practitioners, social workers, counselors, healers. Um, and there's a lot of anxiety around, how do I talk about this with folks I'm working with? How do I bring it up? Is it okay to? How do you write about it? How do you put it in a note? Right? Like there's all this, like the anxiety from working in this field and bringing in the spiritual work, to also like this pressure. Um, and the anxiety is really rooted in the fact that a lot of times we we know that this is more like an art form than a science, and that
Mhm.
pressure around evidence-based really shows up in the work. And one example for us has been around like bringing tarot into the work. I've coached so many therapists informally and formally around how to bring tarot into the work. And I think a lot of times the roadblock is around this thing of like, is it evidence based? How do you talk about it? How do you kind of quote unquote prove its effectiveness? And I think those questions really are important, but aren't the right questions all the time.
Mhm.
And they're important because there's all this pressure on social workers and practitioners and counselors to do evidence-based work. And yet we know that tarot, for example, is this ancient tool that has been used for healing for a long time, longer than any of us have been here, And I think I really struggle sometimes with, and I get sad too around like this powerful tool, this powerful healing tool, and this powerful divination tool that can really be like really transformational for folks in therapy. Like I think about some clients who are like, oh my gosh, like I've been working with tarot for years, but I never brought it up to my therapist because they never asked, or, oh, like, oh my gosh, like how sometimes the transformation can happen with tarot in a way that talk therapy can't do, really. Like it has
Mhm.
limitations. And that's an art, not necessarily a
Mhm.
science.
Mhm.
And I think tarot has gotten this like big boom in popularity from like how many decks exist in the world that you can find now. Like back in the days, it was not like that. You just had access to the Rider Waite or the Thoth or the Marseille, and now there's like this sort of like so many creators and artists making decks, and I love that, and I'm so grateful. Which is why, for us, we really encourage like practitioners to ask, to be curious with your client, because tarot's out there, just like astrology's out there in a way that's, to me more accessible to like millennials and younger generations. And ask, get curious, like what are your healing practices? Like how do you use, what role does spirituality play in your life? Like get curious and ask,
Mhm.
because a lot of times they're waiting for us to ask. They're not going to just tell you
Mhm.
outright. um and that's because of other dynamics at play, but yeah, like ask, get
Mhm.
curious. So yeah, around the evidence-based piece, there's this tarot reader who's really popular, and her name is Jessica Dore, and she has a book. I mean, I remember like people were like sort of loving her daily post on Twitter. I would say
Yeah.
she, kind of represents this shift in looking at tarot more psycho-spiritually or like psychologically based, which I'm really grateful for. And her book, Tarot for Change, you know, um, using the cards for self-care, acceptance, and growth. Um, Super grateful. And I noticed that a lot of people really resonate with her interpretations of tarot. Um, and I'm grateful for it. But one of my pet peeves the most about her approach to tarot is that she's a behaviorist, really. And what I mean by that is that she really technically looks like she really privileges behavior therapies. Like, yeah, behavior therapies. And I noticed, like in her book, um, that she really privileged evidence-based therapy. She really did. She sort of, even in the first like introduction, she talks about it. Um, that we went from looking at therapy as humanities to a science, and that there's like an evidence, a part there that like it shows how it works, like it's working, right? Like behavior therapies work, and that we can use
Mhm.
tarot as that tool too to like understand how to change behaviors, which quote unquote helps us like promote wellness, helps us build capacity for acceptance and amazing outcomes, right? Like that's wonderful and lovely. But that's just one way we think about healing.
Mhm.
Like I
Mhm.
worry about the ways that we focus so much on like the study of somebody's behavior in therapy or like in our healing work that we might miss out on like what's going on too around like their environment, their trauma, their bodies, like energy, like the other aspects of spiritual wellness. And I'm not saying that's like what Jessica's setting out to do, but I think sometimes I feel like we focus so much on behavior change as a measure of wellness. And that's what evidence-based practices privilege too, because there's no way to really like measure psychodynamic work or like talk therapy or the sort of spiritual practices that we are calling in our podcast. Those things, quote unquote, can't be measured because it's an art and it's ancestral and it's connected to the divine and it's not connected to this like rigid way of how this system thinks about healing. And so as much as I appreciate like this book and what she has to offer around tarot, I think that's just one way to use tarot. Just like it's one way to think about therapeutic healing, to be real. Just one way. But I think the attention it gets, because of the way we have short attention spans in this society, like this becomes the way, like people think, oh, that's the way. And there's so many different ways to think about wellness.
Yeah, I appreciate, just what you're bringing in, especially about this book. We've talked about it in a few different ways. I haven't read the book. And I think what you bring up, especially about centering behavior in wellness and overall change, is really just that distinction between a psychologist and a social worker per se, right? Or a therapist who is a social worker, right? Like psychologists don't necessarily, like, they look at the individual, right? And so for social workers, that's definitely like our jam, right? Like that's our lens, is to look at how the community impacts us, how systems, institutions impacts us. And there are, there's some constructive criticism even around that aspect, right? But I think, it'll be really interesting to see what other options come about, so that we can start to have, or continue to have like nuanced conversations about and divination, right? Like not just tarot. You shared about, your interest in bibliomancy, and we talked about that, and folks use other forms of, again, divination practices in their sessions. And so, I think it'll be, again, really interesting to see how things unfold over the next few years, especially around the umbrella of spirituality and wellness. So yeah, like, and evidence-based practice, again, like, I hesitate when I, hear that being centered, because again, what I know is that in that research, in those outcomes, a lot of the times it's not, the foundation of that is not with the intention of communities of color, or, disabled folks, or so on and so forth.
I appreciate the work that she's doing in this book, and I love the way that she conceives tarot and weaves in the magic. And at the same time, I struggle with maybe the part around, and maybe this is like kind of great way that we started with psychospirituality, right? Like thinking about, like you defined it and you centered us in that, like how we think about the dimensions of wellness and how we think about like the wide range of it. and the wide range of these systems, like these therapeutic systems, and how they intersect and connect to spirituality.
For sure.
And yeah, I mean, I think we have to be careful in our work to center certain kind of approaches and like not consider others. And I think some of the things I noticed too when we're talking about like therapeutic work is that evidence-based work does get centered. And then we don't ask those questions of like who did they research? What does effective mean? Like how do we measure somebody's like outcomes, quote unquote? That's why I think behavior therapies are so like married to evidence-based, because the outcomes are like, oh, this person, there's the change, the way we measure change in this person is like they're able to like their emotions are regulated or something, you know, like it's a way that it's like really rigid and useful, but it's not the only way. And I think tarot is so expansive. It's so much bigger. Like you can't put tarot in a box like that. I'm not saying that's what she's doing, but that's what's resonating for me. Like that's one way to read tarot, but you're right. Like tarot also has fortune, like the predictive power of tarot is also valuable. And I notice sometimes in certain spaces, and I see this in wellness spaces, but even like people want to act like, oh, it's just good about focusing on tarot in the present. It is, don't get me wrong. That's how I often use it. But sometimes I'm called to predict, you know, my ancestors offer, and what does it mean for me to like not value that part or like try to like silence that part or something? Which is why we're talking about, right? Like we're talking about the value of divination and like not just tarot, but bibliomancy, tea leaves, coffee. Like there's so many ways. Clouds. I know somebody who divines with clouds. Like there's so many ways for us to get this healing, you know. And for us, we're really inviting people to kind of like ask questions and really be curious about what a person means when they say spiritual. And actually it might take us to the next piece we wanted to talk about, like things that people can consider, you know, like just really being and being aware that everything we know, we have to question, you know, like that's really what it comes down to. Like everything we know about spiritual, social work, counseling, like spiritual practitioners is wrong, because sometimes we need to ask the right questions, or we need to be curious. We don't need to take it at face value. So yeah, like let's kind of maybe make space for like questions people can think about as they consider like spiritual, like to determine like if a person is spiritual, somebody you're working with or you want to work with.
I think I wanted to say something really quickly.
Oh yes,
before we
please.
transition. Okay, before we transition into the questions part, I really appreciate. I don't want to say warning, disclaimer, point of intention. I really appreciate the point of intention where you say we have to be careful, right? Because what I feel like I can see very clearly, even from your explanation about the book, is really what has happened, right? A lot of the times, or historically, in wellness, right? So we talk about the interventions that we use in therapy or in case management, you know, or in any type of wellness support setting, right? And that we have these evidence-based practices, right? And that at the foundation of a lot of the evidence-based practices are indigenous practices, but they've gone through this, if you will, whitewashing, capitalistic approach or lens or whatever, right? And so when I'm saying that, I'm talking about things like CBT, DBT, whatever kind of interventions, narrative therapy is like whatever. What I feel like I'm hearing, even in this piece about how Tarot for Change is kind of set up, is, you know, there was that delineation in indigenous practices, or even this kind of shifting in indigenous practice into evidence-based practice, because indigenous practices are nature-based, right? I talk about this a lot related to research where, narratives are not utilized a lot because it's not quantifiable. You can't quantify it, right? Like it's more experiential. It's more based on connection and relationship building, and you can't necessarily quantify that, right? So when you talk about bringing divination into wellness and it not necessarily being evidence-based practice, like we're talking about things like you mentioned, someone who divines off of, from the clouds and tea leaves and, things like that. That's not quantifiable. You can't
Right.
measure that per se. You can't come into an office with someone and know like, oh, at 3:32 this is what the clouds are going to be looking like, and so this is what I may potentially see or say or whatever, right? Like it just kind of happens, just like nature. And so I don't know, I just needed to say that.
Yes. No, I love that. I mean, you're right. And I mean,
Yep.
I've been reading, yeah, I've been reading, I'm reading this book called Tarot and Psychology. And I think it was
Mhm.
like written in the 90s. And
Mhm.
this
Mhm.
person
It's
was
been right
also
there.
talking. Oh, yeah. He also talks about, I can't remember his name right now, but he talks about how dangerous it's
Rosenberg.
been. Oh, Rosenberg, how dangerous it was. I guess he witnessed that shift in the
Mhm.
late in the early 90s from like therapy to like evidence based, and the pressure from like insurance companies to like find to prove like these outcomes that were measurable. And it's
Mhm.
interesting to see old like
Prolonged
elders or older,
grief.
right,
Prolonged grief. Here we go.
well,
Here we go.
yeah,
Here we
like
go.
measuring grief. Yeah, that's what we're trying to do too in the
Here
DSM,
we
like prolonged
go.
grief. Yeah, yeah. And I think sometimes we want
Ooh.
things to be seen as worthy by trying to align with it. Like, oh, you can use tarot. I'm not saying that's what Jessica's doing, because I also, just be honest, like I don't think that's what she's doing, but I think sometimes we have to prove that something is like worthy by being like, oh, it goes well with evidence-based. Like tarot is a magical tool, but also it goes really well with evidence-based therapies. And a lot of times it's because we have to prove in this profession that like this kind of healing is just as important or something. And it sucks that it has to be like that. And yeah, like what does it mean when we have like a new quote unquote these people in power, or like this defined prolonged grief disorder on the DSM? What does that mean now, right? Like we're competing against a system, right? And a psychological like field that was really designed to like pathologize us. Like it wasn't really designed with this in mind. So I really think spiritual social work and spiritual practitioners are interrupting this, and it's radical and it's really important. And I mean, especially if they're aware, like holding the intersectionality piece, because again, you have to be careful. We have to really be careful, which is why we're inviting, hey, just really be careful. Like, what is your work as a spiritual practitioner? And what do you want to share to clients around that work? Like, how do you get curious with them? How do you make space for them? How do you acknowledge that there's been religious trauma? And how do you conceive of spiritual wellness, right? That's rooted in an intersectional lens. Like, this is what we mean about us being really careful, not us being really careful. And examining the things that we've been taught. Like, again, what we've been taught is not always like really right and not in alignment with freedom and intersectionality. And we have to really make space for the unlearning. Like we said last episode, like making space for the unlearning. It's a daily practice of unlearning, learning, and relearning. Like that is an important frame. The same goes for like spiritual work. So yeah, there's things that we want you to just, yeah, just the mindfulness piece. I think that's really a part of it too, like being aware. Um, yeah,
Okay.
I'm
Okay.
going somewhere
Again,
else.
this
Okay,
is
you want
yeah,
to?
no, no, no.
We can have
This is
like 5 more episodes about this.
like so many conversations about this. Like this is my jam, like this is my jam. And this is, just a window into, why we wanted to start this podcast. Like we got to
Mm.
talk about this stuff. Like this stuff is real, questions.
Okay, yeah. So here's some questions we want y'all to consider to determine. Actually, here's some questions we want spiritual practitioners to consider, and things that we'd like you to keep in mind when you're working with
Mhm.
somebody.
Mhm.
And this begs repeating. I know we mentioned a few questions in our earlier episodes, but this begs repeating. And we'll also mention, and you let us know in the comments too, like if if there are some topics we didn't cover around this umbrella, let us know. Um, Share it in the comments. We would love to have an episode based on if there's something you want to hear, let us know. We'd love to talk about it and build community around it. Um, so these questions are really centered on spiritual practitioners. And we're thinking maybe if you're interested in, let us know if there are clients who want us to help sort of support around questions you might like to ask your therapist or your practitioner, the person that you're working with, a coach, anybody that you're working with in a capacity of like wellness. So we think like at the initial meeting is really important. And that initial meeting could be 1 or 2 or 3 sessions. Like it just really depends. But ask them like what kind of connection they have to like spiritual practices, like do they have a relationship to spirituality? Get curious with them. Like, are they interested in divination? If so, what type of divination do they know or were they exposed to? Thinking about cultural practices, like inviting that into the work. I think many times we get really skittish as practitioners. We're like, I don't know how to ask that question, or no one really talked to me about this in grad school. Well, our work, y'all, is to bring it up. We get to really center this dimension of wellness that gets pushed to the edges, which is something that Jessica mentioned in her book, and I totally agree with. Like a lot of times this work gets pushed to the edges in service of what is evidence-based, right? And our job as practitioners is to really bring it to the center. Get it, like, stop pushing it in the margins. Let's not contribute to the marginalization. Let's contribute to the centering of it, centering intersectional spirituality. And we do that by giving voice to it. Is there anything you want to add, Sequoia? Because I might go on a ramble of like, y'all need to bring the spiritual back. Let's reclaim
No, no.
it.
No, I think that all of that aligns. If we are, kind of continuing with the questions, just asking, what other types of practices are helpful in grounding, what's been your experience with spiritual practices, what's been helpful. Um, yeah.
I also had another one like that might
Mm-hmm.
be important, and I've asked clients this. Who do you follow on social media that aligns with your like spiritual practices or cultural practices,
Mm-hmm.
or
I think that's
like
great.
getting
Mm-hmm.
a sense of like the content that they're consuming, the healing that they're getting from like, me and my clients sometimes talk about Shani Nicholas, or they introduce
Mm-hmm.
me to somebody that I actually hadn't thought about, especially my clients who are like reclaiming their indigenous practices again, like getting a sense of like the education that they're consuming outside of, like somewhere else, and just really getting a sense, or like what books are you reading? Oh, you
Mm-hmm.
do tarot. What deck are you working with? What system do
Mm-hmm.
you work with? What books are you reading about this topic? Just getting really staying curious with them, um,
Mm-hmm.
and inviting that space too. And also like invite and bringing yourself into this work too. It's not just about like bringing yourself, also makes space for the client to bring their full self. So yeah, like
Mm-hmm.
let them know what you're reading, or like things that you like. I've shown some of my clients my decks, like especially
Mm-hmm.
my clients who might be looking for a tarot deck that's more inclusive. I have a lot of that. I'm really committed to like decks that really hit those notes for me. So hey, yeah, like check out this. Actually, you might want to consider this deck if the Rider Waite's not resonating for you. Or, oh, you really like astrology? Well, they introduced me to like an astrologer who's more in line with their values and their political views. Like, just like really get curious and invite that in. I think one question that I often ask is like, what are the cultural or spiritual practices that have shaped you? Like, I know that we get trained like what religious denomination are you affiliated, or I don't ask that question. I feel like because of the trauma, I don't think that's a helpful question. But I often tell people, well, what was a part of your like your upbringing, oh, I went to Catholic school. All right, cool. Well, what was that like for you? Like, how does that show up for you now? What kind of impact has that had on your life, or whether
Mm-hmm.
positive or negative? Like, we have to ask those questions, and it's not just one question in an intake form. It's not just one question in an intake form.
Yep,
It's
for
it's
sure.
a question, lifelong questions you ask in your work with clients. I'm even thinking about like, yeah, that's all I'm thinking about right now. But yeah, just like really being curious and making space for it. And the more you make space for it, the more open a person will be about what their spiritual lineage is, what their practices are, where they're at, and also connecting that to wellness, right? Again, like spirituality and this psycho spirituality, like that's the definition, that great definition that Sequoia
Mm-hmm.
learned. Like, it's an aspect of our wellness. This is how we get well. This is how we get free, y'all. Like, the spiritual is
Mm-hmm.
political, and the spiritual will get us
Mm-hmm.
free too. Like, it's
Mm-hmm.
intersectional. Um,
I think that's great. I think that's great. I hope that those questions, are helpful for other practitioners that are listening. I think those are great, even as places to discuss in supervision, and not just individual supervision, but also like group supervision, role playing with others, how you ask those questions. So yeah, I think that's amazing. Um, if you're ready, Biani, I think this is the place where we kind of transition into resource sharing, share and tell. And you all know this is like my favorite thing to do on the podcast. My favorite segment, is to get into just things that we want to share with you all. And, as always, it's just one of the things that I grew up with and miss about elementary school is listening to and hearing about what other folks are engaging with. And so, yeah, I love this. Um, I was gonna share, and Biani mentioned inner child at the top of the podcast. Um, I was gonna share a book that's been resonating, for Pride Month, for my inner child. But then I thought, even in our as we were talking about like spirituality and what are some of the questions that we ask, you know, and you mentioned like asking folks who on social media they interact with, what kind of books are they reading, and I'm like, ding ding, this will be a great way to tie in our resource list, our spiritually centered resource list. One of the things that I definitely ask my clients is, like what podcasts are they listening to, and I want to share one of the ones that I listen to, and also, highlight our resource list. We have a free resource list of over 50 spiritually centered podcasts. You can find that not only on our website, but our links in our bios, on our Instagram pages. And so, yeah, the podcast that I wanted to share is called Bridgewalkers Tea,
mm,
and it is by a woman. Her name is, oh my gosh, I don't like I can spell it. I don't want to mispronounce it. Manasi. I really hope that I'm saying that correctly. But her work is specifically with spiritualpreneurs, and she
mm,
calls folks that are spiritual and have a business bridge walkers. And her podcast is all about not only like supporting that side of, our identities, but then also bringing in, different types of spiritual topics. And she has a really amazing story, and it's really cool. And I connected with her and found her on TikTok. And so she has an amazing TikTok as well and shares a lot of different resources. So that's my share and tell for this week. Definitely check out Bridgewalker's Tea on Spotify, but then also don't forget to check out our resource list.
I'm writing it down. We also need like a book list. I was just thinking that we need to have like a
Mm,
book list. Um, yes, we were so excited. We have a
a
resource for
list of
y'all.
all our share and tells.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. That's a great idea.
Mm-hmm,
Who would
mm-hmm.
want that? Who would want that? Let us know in the comments if you like a list of our resource share and tell.
Yeah,
I was just
I'm
thinking
sorry I
that.
interrupted. Mm-hmm.
Oh no, no, no! I was just because I wanted to write the book down too. Um, yeah, y'all. Sorry, my brain is. I'm acknowledging like this is real. So many things are brewing in me. So,
Mm-hmm.
um, I wanted to share a deck that I just got, and I have not used it yet, but I was really called to share. And now I'm realizing, should we just do a reading with it? But I'm not, it's all good. Um, I just got this deck and it's been kind of bugging me for a while. It's called the Hip Hop Queens Oracle.
I love that.
Um, and as a hip hop head, a true hip hop head, I was super excited to see a deck about hip hop queens. And I'll just share a few of the cards just because I think they're really cool to look at. So there's a card of Angie Martinez, and the theme is voice. Oh, Bahamadia, knowledge.
I love that.
Aaliyah, angel.
Those are so pretty, so vibrant.
Megan Thee Stallion, pride. With a
Not
stallion in
her
the
with
back.
a horse. I know. I listen. We
Oh,
said it at the
I love
same time. We said
it.
it at the
That's
same time.
hilarious. The brat. Oh, rebellion. I
Interesting.
honestly am only showing the ones that I know, y'all. Just keeping it real because I have to read up on the others. Um, Erica Badu, spirituality. Oh, how timely. That's so funny. We got that card.
Mm-hmm.
Kaylani, superstition.
Oh, they have new people in there. I
Yeah, they
love
got new
that.
people. Beyonce,
Yeah.
of course. Who is excited for her new album, y'all? Is anybody else excited?
I know. It's been all the buzz from the beehive.
Yes. Cardi B, personality. Oh, Mel Monet, fluidity. That's interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, they got Jean Grey though, versatility.
That's a throwback.
I used to love me some Jean Grey, baby.
That's a
Mm.
throwback.
Janae Aiko. I don't know if. Oh,
What's the word they
Eve.
have for her?
Oh, emotions.
Okay. Okay.
That seems
Hmm.
accurate.
Yeah. Hmm.
Eve, change. Okay, that's it. Hip hop, hip hop queens oracle deck. That's fair.
Cool. Cool, 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 cool. I love to
So
see how you're gonna use those.
I know. We'll see. We'll see. I'm definitely using
Mm-hmm.
them. We'll see how that goes. And it comes with a guidebook. So for folks who might not, know who these, they give you a lot of a lot of information about who they are and why they
That's
represent that, which
cool.
is really cool. And it was made
Yeah.
by one of the hip hop journalists. I can't remember her name, but anyhow, that's
Cool.
my share.
I love that. I love that. Well, I let's definitely dive into main takeaways. My main takeaway just from today's episode it's so much. I feel like we dropped so many good nuggets, throughout, but I appreciate this conversation, about defining like spirituality and psychospirituality, you know. I think it'll be interesting to continue to see how those play out and, really are actualized in practice.
Yes. Ooh, yeah. I honestly, I have I don't even know where to start. There's so many. I agree
So
with you. There's so
much.
many gems. Um, I think one of the takeaways that's resonating right now for me is like really inviting people to really get curious
Hmm.
and to examine everything you know, because most times what you know is wrong, or most times what you know needs to be like revisited, right? Like it just needs to be, you need a little bit more attention. Just give it a little bit more attention and ask questions, get curious. Just don't assume
Hmm.
things as true. And I think another takeaway too is like, just I feel like a lot of the sort of definitions we have about spiritual practitioners are really designed to give us like to really confuse people to not bring it into the work. So I hope that
Hmm.
one main takeaway that you all can
Hmm.
at least, I hope there are many main takeaways. We hope, and let us know in the comments what really resonated for you. But we really hope that this is an invitation for you all to bring in the sacred, to bring in the spiritual back in your work. And that can be just being curious and asking questions. It doesn't mean that you have to be a spiritual practitioner to like do this.
Yeah.
But I think making space for it is important. That's the main takeaway. Make space for it. Make
Hmm.
space for it in your
Hmm.
work with clients, folks in community. Make space for it. So that's what I'm hoping you all can take away from this. And why don't y'all let us know your takeaways from today's episode? Please let us know in the comments. Um, and if you haven't done so, like make sure you subscribe to our channel, hit that subscribe button because we will have more episodes to come. We'll be back with episode 5 and you really don't want to miss out. So again, subscribe, like, follow us on Spotify if you haven't, and subscribe to our channel. Um, we want to really thank you for being here with us today. And we hope you'll be back next time for episode 5. We are giving y'all the tea, y'all. Episode 5 and episode 6 are our hot topics. So we're talking about, at least the next episode, are 7 topics you won't hear your therapist talk about, but well. So you really don't want to miss out. Like really, really don't. We're going to talk about a number of things from Brene Brown to the new grief diagnosis in the DSM, to therapy influencers. We're going to talk about psychedelics in therapy and therapy apps and so much more. So, our next episode is about the tea, giving you the tea. And these are the kind of conversations that you wish you could have with your therapist, and you might not be able to, but you can have with us. So,
Hmm.
make sure you come back for episode 5. And if you have any hot topics you'd like us to cover, let us know in the comments. Don't be shy. Bring it up. If there's things you want to talk about, like y'all want to talk about beehive issues, cool. Y'all want to talk about like pop culture or like TV shows, anything that really you're curious about, like let us know.
Hmm. Hmm. I love that. I love that. That makes me think about, even, I don't know if folks watch like the Real Housewives of Atlanta, but one of the women on there, Marlo, who actually happens to be an Aquarius, she's been sharing a lot of mental health history, her sister's mental health history on the show. She currently has custody of her nephews, and I was watching some podcasters, and they were talking about, um, how they feel like her sharing so much of her sister's mental health history is crossing a line. And so that made me think
Mm.
about, like, even in the therapeutic standpoint, or, therapeutic realm, like confidentiality, and is it okay to share, someone else's mental health history on such a platform, right? Like, so yeah, even stuff like that. So yeah, I thank
Mm.
you, Biani, for, setting us up. Um, for what's to come for our next episode. Thanks again for being in community with us and supporting a heart centered podcast by two queer Black femme healers and spiritual social workers who explore the intersection of magic, spirituality, identity, and ancestral connections through the lens of tarot, divination, mysticism, mental health, and everything in between. If you are catching this on the playback, please definitely continue to engage with us in the comment section. Please like the video. If you are listening to this on Spotify, please follow us and also hit the notification bell so you know when we post the episode, and definitely rate us there as well. Subscribe to our YouTube page, and then once you subscribe, you can set a reminder for notifications when we release an episode, just like on Spotify. And you can sign up for the newsletter on our landing page at the website. As I mentioned in my share and tell, also we have a resource list up with over 50 spiritually centered podcasts on that list. So if you're looking for more podcasts that center spirituality, you can definitely check that out. Let us know how you like that. If there are even any that we missed that we need to put on there. Otherwise, we'll see you all in 2 weeks. Looking forward to it.
Bye.